About 75 years ago, in 1948, a biologist at Indiana University published a book called Sexual Behavior in the Human Male. 5 years later, there was a follow-up study about women's sexual behavior in the human female. This was, of course, the work of Alfred Kinsey and his small research team. Kinsey had never set out to be a sex researcher. He was an entomologist. Prior to this, he studied the gall wasp, and he wanted to know everything about variation in the gall wasp species. So he became a sex researcher after he was asked to teach a new course on marriage. This wasn't that uncommon at American colleges and universities in the 1930s, usually taught by a faculty person from biology or sociology. Kinsey said sure, and he went about doing the research he would need for his lecture notes. And he was really appalled by what he found. He found psychiatric and psychoanalytic case studies of a single individual. He found questionnaires and surveys with completely unrepresentative samples. But even worse, he found all kinds of assumptions and moralizing baked in about when sex was normal and when it wasn't. And for Kinsey, this was a problem for two main reasons. One is just as a scientist, he didn't think you should presume what the results would tell you before you did the study. But also, Kinsey was himself queer, and he understood that sexuality wasn't always simply one simple thing. So he applied for a grant and was able to hire this small research team, and they decided to do what they believed to be the first scientific study of human sexual behavior. And they asked people questions one-on-one in interviews. And a Kinsey interview could last for hours and involved hundreds of questions about really specific sex acts and how old people were and how often and so on. And they were able to then, from these questions, get data, loads and loads of data, so that Kinsey could now know what % of Americans had had these experiences, differentiate by the decade of your birth, whether this person was living in a rural area, an urban area, education level, and so on. And the results really stunned Americans. More than a third of men in the study reported that they had had a sexual encounter with another man. Women were reporting rates of premarital and extramarital sex that far exceeded what the 1950s American woman was presumed to be having. And so the whole thing was just a sea change in the way that Americans thought about sexuality and the way that it was researched. So I have the privilege of teaching the history of sexuality in America, and I've been doing that for a long time. And there is so much research. I'm not facing anything like the problem Kinsey faced. There are books about anything you can think of, and more books coming out, more articles coming out all the time. I love to read it, and I love to talk about it with my students. So I've learned about fornication trials in early New England and indigenous rebellions against attempts to outlaw polygamy in the Southwest in the 1700s, and everything else you can think of up through the anti-vice crusades, censorship efforts, policing of queer people, changes to marriage, and so on. So 5 years ago, when I was given this opportunity to write a single-volume history of sex and sexuality in America, I thought, sure. I mean, how hard could that be, right? I mean, I already know it, right? I've already read all the stuff, and I know how the story goes. And so I sat down and started writing everything I knew, sort of in a chronological sweep about the history of sex and sexuality in America. And it was really boring. It was, and when the point at which you've managed to make a book about sex very dull, you have to start over. And so my moment of clarity was figuring out that what I needed were stories. So the book that I've written is 18 chapters, and each chapter tells a different story. And it's been such a privilege to be able to tell stories about people like Thomasine Hall, who was raised in England to be a skilled seamstress, but then at some point in their late teens changed their name to Thomas, put on a soldier's uniform, and fought for the English military in France. who then sailed as a soldier named Thomas to Virginia and worked as a female domestic servant named Thomasine on one of the tobacco plantations performing domestic labor, and who was brought before the highest authorities then present in the English settlements in Jamestown because there were disputes over what sex Thomasine was, which would bear on whether or not they could have potentially committed fornication, sex with an unmarried woman. I learned stories about people like Ida Craddock. Ida Craddock is the least known, most fascinating person, I think, in American history. She wanted to get a PhD, but Penn wouldn't admit her because she was a woman. She wanted to do a PhD in anthropology. So she went off and wrote it herself. She wrote a thesis on what she called phallic antiquities. She was really interested in the obelisk and in other phallic-shaped religious objects. So she also became a sex therapist and marriage counselor. And we're talking about this like the 1890s. And she did this a lot by correspondence. People wrote to her with their problems, and she wrote back. And she based her authority as a sex therapist on the marriage she had to her spiritual husband, who lived in the world beyond, and whom she had never known in real life, but with whom she said she had fantastic sex. There are people in the book that I learned about, like Kiyoshi Kuramiya. And when Kiyoshi was a preteen, he found a copy of the Kinsey report, the first one on sexual behavior in the human male, at a public library. And he says that he just read it cover to cover because Kiyoshi had by that point, already been arrested in a public park in Southern California for having sex with another boy. And for that, he was put in juvenile detention, and then he had to receive court-ordered testosterone injections. Not only that, but Kiyoshi had been born in 1943 at the Heart Mountain incarceration site in Wyoming to parents who were both Japanese-American citizens. And that combination of experiences made him a lifelong civil rights crusader, anti-war protester, and advocate for LGBTQ people and for education around HIV and AIDS. Truly amazing person. So I found all of these stories, and I thought about how important they are, not just as narrative devices. I mean, we all enjoy reading a good story, and I thought it was a good way to hold all of this information together without overwhelming the book. But I also found in writing about stories that so often sexuality is a story. We have stories we tell about our own sexuality. It's a way of telling who we are. Of course, the coming out narrative, which really starts in the 1970s with gay liberation, that says, come out of your closets and let the world know who you are and where you are. That is a story that people are telling. We also have stories that we tell about sexuality in relationship to our communities, explaining what our families believe or what our religious groups do or don't believe about sexuality and morality. Our politics tell stories about sexuality, and I think we are living through a really extraordinary moment in sexual storytelling at a national political level, whether it is abortion rights activists encouraging women to tell their abortion stories publicly as a way to raise awareness about how common abortion is, how safe it is, and how life-changing and saving it can be. We also are hearing lots of stories about other people. And this is, I think, one of the themes from my book is how often sexuality functions as a story that Americans have told about other people they wanted to disadvantage or set apart. And sexuality has served as, unfortunately, a very efficient way of saying who is normal and who is not, and therefore who is deserving and who is not. So I think about these stories. I thought about them as I was writing this book and as I was trying to figure out how to actually make it work. It was so much harder to write this book than I thought it would be, but I'm really inspired by the stories that I learned. Because one of the things that Kinsey discovered with all of this data he had was that variation was the norm. When you look at the vast range of human sexual behavior, you don't find a statistically normal center, let alone what Kinsey would have immediately dismissed as sort of a moralizing idea of sexual normalcy. But when I wrote my book, I also realized that my initial mistake was to write as if there was one central main plot line that would carry my reader from the beginning to the end. And instead, what I found were individual different stories that were each important for their own sake in telling this history, because I do think that when we look at the history of sexuality as well, we really need to pay attention to all the variation. Thank you.